Today we are going to showcase on 4 very interesting cases about transient hyperinsulinism. So we are going to focus mainly about the dilemmas in terms of diagnosing hyperinsulinism, especially the dilemma of 2 major endocrine causes of hypoglycemia, hyperinsulinism and cortisol deficiency. How they can interplay is what going to be the major part in that regard. One can be used in that regard. So now we'll move forward to a second case. Looks a bit similar to the first one, but is different. So Sayan, you can come up and discuss this case.
So I start the case from the day 13 of so the child presented to us on day 13 with repeated episodes of hypoglycemia since the first day of life. Now, he had a history of hypoglycemia since day 1, along with respiratory distress initially, and according to his mother, had also low SpO2. The child was initially in a setup, referred to another, and when he finally came to us, he was referred from 3 hospitals before presenting to us. So the initial glucose requirements are not available to us presently, but the 3rd hospital which referred the patient to us, in the discharge summary, it was mentioned that he had a GI requirement persistently from 10 to 15 milligram per kg per minute. When the respiratory distress and his vitals stabilized, the child, along with IV infusion, was also given breastfeeds. But that didn't improve his glycemic control, and the hypoglycemia persisted. Now, coming to the birth history, he was delivered by emergency LSCS due to an absent blood flow on Doppler. He had a birth weight of 1.54 kg and a gestational age of 36 weeks. So he was in fact SGA, and his mother also had a risk factor of pregnancy-induced hypertension. So coming to the history then, mother didn't have any history of diabetes. His mother's blood group was A positive. There was no maternal history of ingestion of any drugs. There was no history of early onset of diabetes mellitus in the family. No history of no omphalocele or ear creases in the baby, no midline defects or micropenis, and there was no hepatomegaly on examination. So the clinical summary is that we have a 13-day neonate with hypoglycemia from day 1, with SGA, preterm birth asphyxia, requiring very high glucose infusion rates of around 15 milligram per kg per minute, had maternal PIH and absent blood flow on Doppler.
So how is this child different from the case Naveen presented?
So this his child, the case which Naveen presented also was a preterm with SGA, but his child presented with hypoglycemia from day 3. This case has early onset hypoglycemia from day 1, and this child also had respiratory distress at the onset. So
which was there as well.
Okay.
So I think these two are pretty similar cases. If you look at your case and Naveen's case, both are pretty similar. From our perspective, this child is presented later as compared to we were called at day 3, here we are called at day 13. How will that impact the overall workup? Do you think it will have an impact when we work up now compared to whether we are worked up at day 3?
So as you just mentioned previously, initially the cortisol growth hormone responses will be normal, but as the hypoglycemia gets prolonged, the cortisol and GH will be used up and they might lead to low.
So I think one thing which you should keep in your mind right away is that you may see apparent exhaustion of the response to cortisol, which is important. Second, you don't have a hepatomegaly, which is there. Again, an issue. Yes. These are the 2 major differences which are there, but let's go into workup.
So the differential diagnosis with a child presenting with very early onset hypoglycemia and requiring very high glucose infusions are hyperinsulinism. Now, whether this is prolonged or persistent, according to the clinical parameters, as already discussed by Naveen and Sir, SGA, birth asphyxia, maternal PIH will point towards prolonged hyperinsulinism, which is the most common form of hyperinsulinism that we get. The pointers towards persistent hyperinsulinism, which weren't present in this case, were that of a LGA, which was not there, and there was no family history of early onset diabetes.
Can persistent hyperinsulinism be AGA?
Yes, the milder defects of GDH, GCK.
So all the others can be there. So what are you trying to say that potassium ATP channel defects are unlikely?
Yes. And these were the investigations which were done on day 13 at the referral hospital. Now you see that this child was hypoketotic with a ketone of 0.6, but a very, very low cortisol of 5.1.
This is microgram per liter. This is not that low. So this is from the other units.
Okay,
This
sir.
is not nanomoles per liter from the other hospital. So this is again like 150 or something.
Okay.
So this is inappropriately low. So this is important to emphasize because it is not that low, but it is not increased.
Okay.
So it's on the lower range. So cortisol is low as per the criteria for hypoglycemia.
Okay, sir.
And insulin?
And insulin is detectable. It is more than 2.
So what is the difference between your case and Naveen's case?
His cortisol has an adequate response of more than 550, and insulin was 13.
So maybe we were at a very early stage. That's why his insulin response was much robust. Maybe that was anyway coming down with time in this case, or maybe everything has happened, so all those mechanisms will start working. Plus, the cortisol response in your case is low. It is like 150, which should be more than 550. So which means now the question is it primarily hyperinsulinism or is it primarily cortisol deficiency? This is the pediatrician asking.
Yes. So this was the diagnostic dilemma of whether the low cortisol is the primary problem or the high insulin. As already discussed by sir, very high glucose requirements can only point towards a primary hyperinsulinism, not a low cortisol. If it was a primary defect of low cortisol, only replacement of glucose at the rate maximum 6 milligram per kg would have solved the problem. So this is what we feel was the primary issue.
And second, ketones.
Yes, sir.
You have absent ketone, which is 100% sensitive, 100% specific for hyperinsulinism. So anybody who has a detectable insulin with hypoglycemia, high GIR, and a low ketone is hyperinsulin. Now, whether your cortisol is low or high, that you can debate. It is there, but for me, it's hyperinsulinism because GIR also is very high.
So this was the dilemma which the referring physician also faced, but he at that time preferred to give a bolus dose of hydrocortisone. After giving hydrocortisone, the blood sugars increased temporarily, but didn't reach the normal expected of more than 70. But again, the next day, symptomatic hypoglycemia episodes recurred, and then the child was referred here.
So I think the big message is that we have always been saying that if your cortisol is less than 550 during hypoglycemia, this is cortisol deficiency. This is true, but this is partially true. In somebody who is non-ketotic with a very high glucose requirement, it may be exhaustion, which we need to be aware. So don't rush with hydrocort in this setting. Think of other options.
Now, when the child presented to us, as I already discussed, according to the clinical history and the investigations available, we initially made a diagnosis of hyperinsulinism. And this is where we went on to add diazoxide at the minimal dose of 6 milligrams per kg per minute. And as the diazoxide has a period of, the onset of action of diazoxide will take around 5 to 7 days, we called the child for follow-up at around 2 weeks later. And this time, he was maintaining normal glucose levels, was having adequate weight gain, and this is when we decided to taper the hydrocortisone and stop it. And we managed to stop hydrocortisone last month at around 14th of April, and he was doing fine. Now comes the question of how did we taper diazoxide and stop it in this case. The child was all throughout maintaining blood sugars of 95 to 100. And never did he require a dose increase of diazoxide. And as the child was gaining weight, his milligram per kg of diazoxide on its own decreased. And gradually and as the child wasn't having any symptomatic episodes of hypoglycemia, we persisted with it and stopped his diazoxide 2 weeks back in the starting week of May. And the total duration of treatment was 12 weeks according to his postnatal age.
So the big message here is that you can have an exhausted cortisol response, which will happen in that setting. And this is what was shown by Dr. Khalid's paper in that perspective. And this was the first paper which looked into this regard. There are further other publications which are available.
Yes. So this question, which was raised by Dr. Hussain, was that as we already know, any stress in an infant or neonate, as I already mentioned, the cortisol should be more than 550. But is every stress for a neonate similar? We had many papers, and it has been shown that surgery, ICU admission, all lead to an appropriate cortisol response. But in case of hypoglycemia, the cortisol response is always subnormal. So based on these questions, Dr. Hussain made a research study with the following research questions in mind. Is it a lack of a central drive which leads to a decreased cortisol response? Is it the timing of the sample? Like if we take the sample when the child is having hypoglycemia, maybe his central axis isn't developed and it requires a prolonged time. So is this the cause? And the third cause is whether the high levels of insulin have any central action to do with the impairment of central drive. So these were the three initial questions by which Dr. Hussain proceeded. And how did he proceed with this study? He took 13 hyperinsulinemic neonates and he excluded all those who were giving diazoxide, cortisol, had midline facial defects and other syndromic features, and he made them euglycemic for 72 hours. After that, he had an induced fast. During the induced fast, every 15 minutes, the sample of cortisol was taken, and at the time of hypoglycemia, all the critical samples were taken. What did he find? He found that the mean cortisol concentration was 156 before the hypoglycemic episode and 182 at the time of hypoglycemia. So we can very well make out that there is no significant change in this. This was the first thing. Now the second thing which he did to find out whether the lack of central drive was the main thing is that he divided the 13 hyperinsulinemic neonates into two cohorts of 7 and 6. The second lot of 6, at the time of hypoglycemia, he checked their ACTH levels and gave a dose of Synacthin, and thereafter followed both the cohorts every 10 minutes for the next 15 minutes to check for the level of cortisol. This is what he found at that point of time, that the mean cortisol concentrations for those who weren't given Synacthin, you can see it was pretty similar. Again, not an adequate response. But the 6 neonates who received Synacthin, you can see a very significant response from 252 in those who didn't receive Synacthin to more approximately 6 times increase to those who received Synacthin. And he also found that the mean plasma ACTH concentrations were inappropriately low in all 6 neonates receiving ACTH, and it was 13.2. So this is on the basis of these findings, he said that the inappropriately low plasma ACTH, the cause of which is located at the level of pituitary or hypothalamus. And he also found various other research papers which said comparing a single hypoglycemic event to those having recurrent or persistent hypoglycemic episodes, the CNS adaptation was further reduced in those cases. But he didn't give us the actual cause of decreased central drive. And so this is the scope for.
Do you see in clinical practice these things?
So,
where else in clinical practice do you see this thing?
So the lack of central drive.
You see hypoglycemic unawareness is also a counter-regulatory failure in type 1 diabetes where there is more insulin. So simple as that, if you have a persistent hypoglycemia, recurrent hypoglycemia, you will see this.
Yes.
So this is just a rapid thing that you are seeing in the newborn period. It's the same thing. Type 1 diabetes, recurrent hypoglycemia, you will see autonomic failure, you will see cortisol failure, and all those may be linked. So I think this is just the manifestation of the same thing. Very simple to understand. Don't go into all complexities.
Okay,
that if you have persistent hypoglycemia, one, your stores are used up. Second, your brain is responding differently. It says, how much will I respond? So how much cortisol will I produce? It will come down. So this is what is happening. In Naveen's case, it was day 3. So you had good cortisol response. If you had waited for 13 days, cortisol would have been low. So I think this is the key message. Hyperinsulinism, first of all, you have to look for the causes of transient and prolonged hyperinsulinism. If they are there, you can manage them with dextrose and diazoxide. If they are not there, do not go for any genetic testing. Do a diazoxide response. And when we say diazoxide response, start with 5, wait for 4-5 days, go up to 10 to 15. No response is a failure. If there is a response, don't bother. You continue treatment. So I would say clinical management is very important. If you want to look at GDH, look at ammonia. Don't go for a genetic diagnosis. It's not going to help you, except maybe all these neurological features may develop. If, however, there is no response to diazoxide, go ahead and do a genetic workup for a potassium ATP defect. And this has to be ideally done in both parents and the child. If you see a recessive defect, so both alleles are affected, this child is never going to respond to diazoxide, needs a long-acting octreotide or a surgery. And this has to be a palliative surgery. You can't correct it completely. If, however, the defect is there in the father, which means there is an imprinting problem, and this would then suggest a focal form, do a fluorodopa PET. If you see a focal lesion, do a surgical resection. If you see a diffuse injury, diffuse region, it's again like the same, palliative surgery will be there. If you find no defect or Beckwith-Wiedemann syndrome, now remember Beckwith-Wiedemann syndrome should improve over time and it may respond to diazoxide. But if it is not improving, they can still have a focal lesion. So you can then go forward in that perspective. So to summarize, first of all, exclude a transient form and a prolonged form. Once you have done that, start on diazoxide. Responding, no worries, do a ammonia level, which will give you the clue. Now, if there is no response to diazoxide, go for both mother, father, and child's potassium ATP channel defect. Recessive requires surgery versus a lanreotide. While if it is a imprinting form coming from the father, do a fluorodopa PET. If it shows a focal lesion, surgery, diffuse, palliative. If, however, you can't do a genetic test or the Beckwith-Wiedemann study is there, then you again have to do a fluorodopa PET. So this will really tell you when to do fluorodopa PET and when to do a genetic study. So vast majority, see, most of it will come here, will come like 80% will come here, maybe 10-15% will come here, 5% will require all that. So don't rush with those genetic diagnoses immediately because you will have a confusion in that situation. So increased insulin effect should be considered if you have a high GIR, low ketone, hepatomegaly, hypokalemia, glucagon response, very important. High insulin levels are not essential. 18% of children with hyperinsulinism will not have even detectable insulin. So this is important. Very importantly, SGA, you have to think of a prolonged form. LGA, think of a potassium ATP channel defect. And diazoxide is the key. So you should have diazoxide and immediately start diazoxide and see the response, which will give you the clue in that perspective. So before we close and we'll take some questions there, you can go and have a look at our website, look at our book is also available and the application which will guide in that perspective.